Welcome, everyone. We appreciate you signing up for and participating in today's webinar. I am Tara King, a Senior Project Director at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS for short. AAAS is the world's largest general science association and the publisher of the Science family of journals. I serve as a Center Coordinator for the S-STEM Resource and Evaluation Center, which is abbreviated as the S-STEM REC. The AAAS S-STEM REC is happy to organize this webinar, facilitated by our REC partners and colleagues at MN Associates, Inc., to assist you in developing components of your research and evaluation plans for your 2025 NSF S-STEM proposals. As you enter the webinar, please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like. After providing some housekeeping information, sharing a bit about the AAAS S-STEM REC, and directing you to resources that may be helpful as you're preparing your S-STEM proposal submission, I'll then turn things over to Kavita Mittapalli, CEO of MN Associates, Inc., who will be leading today's webinar. Next slide, please. We'd like to take a moment to see who is in the audience today. So what we'll do is launch a short poll to gather some information about you all, and we'll give you a minute or two to complete it. Okay, I'll give it about 30 more seconds. See the results. So in terms of roles, we have a good number of PIs, grant writers, followed by Co-PIs, and then evaluators and researchers. In the audience today, a good number of people also chose other. If you'd like to write in the chat what you mean by other, feel free to do so. In terms of track, we have most of our participants in track 2, about 50%, followed by track 1, 39%, and track 3 at 17%. Institution types, primarily undergraduate four-year institutions or PUIs. We have a good number of four-year colleges and universities that are Research 1, and also 15% are community college faculty. Thank you for joining us. And in terms of MSIs, primarily most universities are not in MSI. And then we have a majority of participants today who are first time submitting an NSF S-STEM grant proposal. Welcome and thank you for joining us. So thanks for taking a moment to share your responses. It's always good to get more information about our attendees as it informs Kavita and her colleagues to tailor the information that they're presenting. Okay, next slide, please. Let's go over a few housekeeping items. Please keep your microphone on mute when not speaking. At any time, you can write questions or comments in the chat. Continue to introduce yourself if you'd like, say hello. We also have the Q&A feature enabled, so we encourage you to post your questions there, as well as upvote others' questions that you'd like to hear the answers to. When we get to the Q&A portion of the webinar, and if you wish to speak to answer your question or ask your question, you can use the raise your hand button and we'll call on you, and then we will unmute you so that you can speak. If you're comfortable doing so, we welcome you to turn on your camera. To help us get to know one another, please rename yourself to include your institution name or abbreviation and share your pronouns if you wish. Also, we're happy to have 2 American Sign Language interpreters joining us today. In addition, we're pleased to have a live transcriptioner providing closed captioning. Our thanks to these individuals for helping us make the information presented in this webinar more widely accessible. The slides being presented today can be found on the AAAS S-STEM Rec website. If you'd like to follow along with the slides on your computer, you can download them. Let me put that link in the chat for you. You go to that website to download the slides. Also on the same webpage will be a recording of today's webinar when it becomes available. We'll post it there. We hope that the webinar runs smoothly for you today, but please, if you have any technical difficulties or questions, contact my colleague Jamila Blake in the chat or send her an email at jblake@AAAS.org. And finally, we would really appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. We'd like to know how useful it was for you and any suggestions you have to improve it. We'll include a link to the participant survey in the chat later on. In addition, the survey link will appear when you exit the webinar today. We thank you in advance for sharing your thoughts to help us improve our offerings for you. Next slide. So for anyone who's just joining us, hello and welcome. My name is Tara King, and I am the Center Coordinator of the AAAS S-STEM Resource and Evaluation Center, or REC for short. I'm happy to organize this webinar as part of the REC's work, which is made possible by funding from the National Science Foundation. Before I jump into telling you more about the AAAS S-STEM REC, it's important for me to share a few disclaimers with you. This material is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation under grant number 2224093. Any opinions, findings, interpretations, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this material are those of its authors and do not represent the views of the AAAS Board of Directors, the Council of AAAS, AAAS's membership, or the National Science Foundation. Additionally, the AAAS S-STEM REC is promoting consultation with MN Associates, Inc., as they are a REC partner, but this does not constitute an endorsement of MN Associates, Inc. as evaluators by the National Science Foundation. Moreover, I want to share upfront that AAAS does not have any information about if or how recent executive actions and memos from the administration may impact the 2025 NSF S-STEM solicitation. We're waiting to hear more information from NSF S-STEM program officers about this, and we'll share any relevant information with the S-STEM community as soon as it's made available. If you're curious, NSF does have a website with guidance regarding their implementation of recent executive orders. I'll post that link in the chat, and then they also have a contact form that you can use. I'll post that in the chat as well. Okay, next slide. So I'll give you a quick overview of the AAAS S-STEM REC. The management of the S-STEM Resource and Evaluation Center, or REC for short, was awarded to AAAS in October 2022 through a competitive NSF proposal process. The S-STEM REC is a new type of investment by NSF to create a greater infrastructure, build community, coordinate work, and synthesize findings across the entire S-STEM portfolio of projects, which includes over 600 funded S-STEM programs at different types of colleges and universities across the country. The REC's work focuses on promoting the exchange of ideas, resources, opportunities, and knowledge about effective strategies and practices to increase the number of talented low-income students who obtain degrees and careers in STEM. The activities of the REC work across multiple levels. For instance, we support the effectiveness of the S-STEM portfolio through publishing S-STEM outcomes and impacts reports. We build the capacity of current and prospective S-STEM awardees through webinars like this one. And we support S-STEM scholars, STEM persistence, and professional development through convening an annual in-person scholars meeting. We welcome you to visit our website and learn more about the REC and join our mailing list to stay updated and informed. I'll pop those links in the chat too. Next slide. So while the REC is managed by AAAS in coordination with NSF, we could not reach our goals without significant contributions of our full team, which includes MN Associates, Inc., who is providing research and evaluation technical assistance support to current and prospective awardees, American Institutes for Research, who is conducting research to create 2 impact and outcomes reports of the S-STEM program at the national level, Quality Education for Minorities Network, who informs our efforts to connect with, support, and learn from minority-serving institutions, and the Center for Evaluation and Research for STEM Equity at the University of Washington, who serves as the evaluator of the REC. Next slide. We'd like to make you aware of a set of complementary webinars the REC is hosted, facilitated by MN Associates, Inc., to provide research and evaluation planning technical assistance support. So today's webinar will be offered again on February 18th, and there will be a second offering of the webinar titled Tips on Developing Your Research and Evaluation Plans on Thursday of next week. I'll post the registration links in the chat. Also, Kavita will talk more about this in her presentation, but our partners at MN Associates, Inc. have created a really useful guidebook on preparing research and evaluation plans for NSF S-STEM grant proposals. This new resource is now available on the REC website. And finally, in addition to interacting with the MN Associates, Inc. team during these webinars, you can seek their help with your questions related to research and evaluation planning by completing a request form with your specific inquiry. So let me post all of these links for you so that you can access them now. And next slide. We also want to inform you about our 2025 S-STEM proposal preparation webinar series. Unfortunately, the first two events in this series have been canceled, but the webinars on February 12th and 19th will be held. You're welcome to register for one or both of these sessions. I'd like to highlight that the webinar on February 12th will include a panel of current S-STEM PIs from community colleges or minority-serving institutions who will provide their insights. Additionally, NSF S-STEM program officers have scheduled drop-in hours this month. I'll post those links in the chat so you can check them out. And next slide. And finally, the NSF website has extremely useful resources as you prepare for your NSF S-STEM grant proposal. These include the full text of the program solicitation, a recording of an overview webinar that explains the solicitation requirements in detail, and an FAQ document that answers the most commonly asked questions about the solicitation. Let me post these 3 links in the chat, and prospective PIs are strongly encouraged to view them before submitting their proposal. Okay. Now, it is my pleasure to get into the meat of the webinar today and pass the program over to Kavita Mittapalli, CEO of MN Associates, Inc. Kavita?
Thank you so much, Tara and AAAS for the opportunity. Thank you so much. Hello and welcome, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, based on where you are joining us. From today, we are so glad that you have taken the time to be with us today at this webinar. I am Kavita Mittapalli with my team members Nina Dallas-Ellis and Stephen Petritis. Nina is a senior associate at M&A and Stephen is an associate at M&A. We are a research and evaluation firm. We are the evaluation TA providers for the S-STEM REC at the AAAS. So before we begin this session today, I'd like to mention a couple of things, especially in terms of the objectives of the webinar today. So there are primary and secondary objectives. Primary, of course, is to assess prospective S-STEM grant project stakeholders, such as yourselves, in developing your project's logic model and or theory of change, and also identify some of the common design features and examples of both logic model and theory of change. The secondary aim is to engage all of you in having discussions and dialogues about the solicitation and any other questions that you may have about logic model and theory of change. Also develop a standard resource portfolio to the lifespan of the S-STEM project from proposal to closeout. And Tara had very kindly mentioned about the guidebook, so we strongly encourage you to take a look. One of the chapters actually is fully dedicated to logic model and theory of change. It goes into a lot of details, more based on what I'm going to talk about today. So you can also see some exercises, some templates that you could use to develop your logic model. We're also gathering questions and understand the needs of you all and both current attendees as well as needs of prospective awardees. So let's begin. Next slide, please. The agenda is very short and sweet. We will be talking through some of the recent changes for the 2025 S-STEM solicitation, number 25-514. Then we will dig deeper into theory of change, logic model. We'll be sharing some templates and examples, real examples of S-STEM logic model, and you will get to do a group exercise. There is no test, so you don't have to drop out yet. It's only an exercise, so you can do that in your own group, or you could just have fun, take a look, cheat, whatever works for you. We'll also talk a little bit about the how and when to engage a researcher and evaluator. We often get questions as to, well, when should we bring an evaluator on board? When should we bring a social science researcher on board? Who does what kind of work? So we're going to address that. We are also sharing a lot of references, especially some of the references have the real template link. So you can just download, use them as you wish for your proposal. And then at the end, we'll take some questions. Next slide, please. All right, so before we get into the nitty-gritty of a logic model, let's talk about some very high level and some very critical changes that have happened for the 2025 S-STEM solicitation number 25-514, which right now is still due on March 4th. So the maximum for track 1 proposals, the maximum changes have occurred in the track 1 proposals. The maximum award amount has increased up to $2 million for 6 years. Those institutions who are submitting track 1 proposals may not have an active STEP or STEM award in the past 5 years. Really important. Track 1 proposals must include an initial planning or capacity building period, which is the first year. And you may also have a project manager or a coordinator who would take care of these duties. Therefore, in the first year, which is considered the planning or capacity building period for track 1 proposals, scholarships should not be awarded in the first year, right? So they should be awarded after that first planning year is done, which means that you have 5 years for awarding the scholarships to your S-STEM scholars. Again, another important change here, at least 50% of all the funds must be provided solely as pure scholarships to cover the cost of attendance and entered as participant support stipends in the budget form. And in terms of the amount of scholarships to be awarded for track 1 proposals, 15K per year for undergraduates and $20,000 per year for graduates. Again, keep in mind the S-STEM scholarships are last dollar scholarships, which help to fill the unmet need. And the details are presented in section 5A, 4B. So please check it out. Please do read the solicitation page to page, cover to cover. Highlight them as much as you need to because these changes really, really matter. Next slide, please. And some of the other changes that are affecting all the proposals through the tracks, track 1, 2, and 3 is one-page analysis of job prospects is no longer required. It used to be required for a long period of time, but now they are not required and they should not be included as a supplementary document. The collaborative planning grants, I know some of you probably have the collaborative planning grant, that has been removed from the S-STEM solicitation altogether this year. Instead, those PIs and co-PIs who are interested to apply for a collaborative plan, they're encouraged to consider developing a planning proposal. Again, the details are in section 2B1 program description. Another aspect is for proposals for the duration of 6 years, the current and pending support should be reported for the first 5 years of the project. And the proposals requesting a 6-year duration must be submitted to research.gov and not grants.gov, because grants.gov has its limitations and it will not accommodate 6-year budget. This is the most important because we are talking about this today. An evaluation plan logic model or theory of change is expected. The way I read it, it is mandatory and should be included as a supplementary document. Now, some of you may think or may ask, well, can we include that in the project description? The answer is, it depends. If I were you, I would not include that in the project description because you have a real estate problem. You only have 15 pages, right? And if the solicitation says you should include that as a supplementary document, I would say yes, include that as a supplementary document, because a logic model, if well done, takes up 3/4 of a page or even a full page. So I would not waste real estate on developing or using or embedding a logic model into your main 15-page project description. All right, so proposals must include a project model, and the logic model or theory of change must inform the evaluation plan. And that's what we're going to talk about today. All right, next slide, please. All right, what is a logic model? Most of you already know this, but I'm going to say this anyway. So logic model is a visual representation or a diagram or a matrix that outlines the logical relationship between the various components of a program. In this case, it would be our S-STEM program. A logic model provides a very structured way to illustrate how resources, activities, outputs, and outcomes are interconnected, and they also interact. And overall, they contribute to the goals of the initiative. The purpose of a logic model is to clarify the underlying assumptions and context, and essentially the logic behind the program, which will help communicate this information clearly and concisely. So a logic model really is a structured approach that illustrates, again, how the resources or inputs, the activities that you're going to be doing through your program, the estimated outputs, and the outcomes, which are again interweaved, and most essentially, they are interacting with each other to achieve your S-STEM program's overall goals. The way I look at it, a logic model is really like a treasure map of a program. In your case, the S-STEM program, which is guiding all of you through the logical twists and turns with the clarity of a well-crafted plan. Next slide, please. So why is a logic model important and why is it needed, right? As I mentioned, for one, it is required. Now, a logic model is important for grant proposals because it really is helping to clarify the relationship. Remember, I used the word interweave, interact, and I'm talking about the relationship between the various components. And these components are the resources or inputs, the activities, the outputs, and the intended outcomes of your S-STEM program or project. The logic model also helps the proposers, which is you in your case, will articulate the program's objectives, the activities, and outcomes. It also helps to identify the potential gaps and needs in your program's overall design, allowing you to make any necessary adjustments before submitting the proposal. So for evaluation purposes, a logic model provides a general framework for assessing the overall efficacy and effectiveness of your S-STEM program. So what happens is, by mapping out your program's logic and any identifying key performance indicators, evaluators in your program can easily measure the program's progress and success in achieving the outcomes. And these outcomes could be both short-term outcomes, midterm, or long-term. So a logic model is really helping the stakeholders, including the evaluators, identify areas where the program may need improvement, where are the gaps, and then adjust the program elements to achieve the outcomes. So logic model is an essential tool for both the grant proposal purposes as well as when awarded for evaluation purposes, as it helps to ensure that the program goals are articulated well and that the program is designed and implemented the way it is meant to be. Next slide, please. So I used a bunch of terms like inputs, resources, activities, and processes, outputs, outcomes, context, and assumptions. So let's explore parts of a logic model. So the key components of a logic model, a typical logic model, let me put it that way, are inputs or resources. So these resources, first of all, would be the NSF funding. So if you don't have funding, obviously you cannot run your program. Also staffing. Who is going to do the work? PIs, the co-PIs, you have senior personnel, you have the evaluators, you have a social science researcher. Also the equipment and materials that are directly invested in the program. So again, the inputs or resources are those that are directly invested in the program, which constitute funding, first of all, staff who's going to do the work, equipment and materials as they apply that are invested in the program. Now, in terms of activities and processes, these are specific actions and processes that are carried out as part of the program. What do we mean by that? By activities and processes, we mean the interaction, the interventions, the activities that you say you're going to do. For instance, it could be faculty advising, you're doing mentoring, you are probably doing a first-year experience. All those EBPs, evidence-based practices, are the activities or the processes. These are all under activities or processes for your S-STEM program. Outputs. The outputs are more like kind of, bean counting, the direct and immediate products or results of the activities. So outputs are anything that are often quantifiable and tangible. How many, how often, how many participants, how often is a particular activity going to take place, how many workshops, how many field visits, how many industry tours. It's the how many is what constitutes the outputs. So these are, again, the direct and immediate products or results of the activities. These are often quantifiable and tangible. As I mentioned, examples being number of workshops conducted, how many participants were reached, how many scholars attended, and if any equipment or materials were distributed. That constitutes the outputs of a very typical logic model. Now, the critical aspect of a logic model, I mean, all the items are critical, but again, going to the ultimate, the last item is the outcomes. So the short-term, intermediate, and long-term changes or benefits that really result from the outputs and the various activities. Kind of conditional that if we do all these things, we expect to see these things happen. The if and then conditional is the outcomes. So outcomes are generally characterized, as I mentioned, into short-term outcomes, intermediate, and long-term. There are different types and different models of logic models. Some of the logic models will just have a simple outcomes. Overall, we want to see this. Overall, we expect to see this at the end of the grant. Or you will also see some very complicated schemas or visual representations that will parse out the short-term outcomes, the intermediate outcomes, and the long-term outcomes. So it really depends. Let's look at the examples of some of the short-term outcomes, right? These are some of the immediate changes that occur as a result of program activities that could constitute short-term outcomes. Then I'll give you examples in a minute. And right now, I just want to define what these mean. Intermediate outcomes are changes that occur in the medium term. For example, if your program, if S-STEM program is for 6 years or 5 years, maybe you can expect to see some outcomes, some transfer rates, for example, right, in 3 years, in 2 years, in 4 years. Those are intermediate outcomes while the grant is still active, right? You're still running your program and you're seeing intermediate outcomes or results. The long-term outcomes are those that are the ultimate goals or impacts, like the efficacy that the program seeks to achieve over an extended period. At the end of the grant, we can expect an overall change in the economic forum, in the economic aspect or workforce. As a result of S-STEM, we see this happen. That's the long-term outcomes. Now I have a little icon at the bottom, which is a context and assumptions. As an evaluator who is trained in mixed methods, I really prescribe to having a context and assumptions when developing a logic model. So these assumptions or context, well, first of all, context really matters. We know that. So context or assumptions are beliefs that we have about the program even before going in. So we know, we work at an institution, we know what policies, practices, and infrastructures already exist at our institution. That constitutes the underlying assumptions and context, which builds our S-STEM proposal. So assumptions are the beliefs that we have about the S-STEM program, the people involved, and the way we think the program will work. So this is generally a theory that we are talking about the underlying beliefs, the context as to how our S-STEM program will ultimately work. So these are also validated with research and experience. So assumptions underlie and they influence the program decisions we make. That's why I keep saying context really, really matters. So let's talk about what really constitutes assumptions. So assumptions are principles, beliefs, or ideas. The examples could be the existing needs of your scholars. So you need to know what are the needs of the scholars based off of which why you're applying for an S-STEM, and this is how the needs are going to be filled. So you need to know the needs of your scholars, the problem, and also the situation under which the S-STEM scholarship is built upon. You also need to know the existing resources and staffing. Do you have the capacity to do this? Do you know the way the program will operate? What are some of the institutional policies and practices that may enable or hinder your S-STEM program? You should also have a fair idea of what the program expects to achieve. What is the general knowledge base of your program? In addition, you also want to know the external environment under which your program is going to be functioning at. Right? So again, assumptions or context are really the ones that are really playing a very, very important role when you're working on your grant. All right. Next slide, please. All right. So there are two models here. We are going to spend a little bit of time in terms of explaining a theory of change and logic model. Keep in mind that the solicitation 25-514 says that a logic model or a theory of change. You don't have to include both. Again, real estate is a big issue, so be careful as to what you want to do, what kind of a visual or what kind of a schema you want to include, but again, include them in the supplementary document, just because the space is limited, right? So what is the theory of change and how is it different from a logic model? So if you look at the two models here side by side, you will see that there is some overlap between the two in terms of the metrics or indicators of success used, right? However, the main distinction between a logic model and a theory of change is that a logic model describes a more linear and logical sequence, showing what the intervention's intended outcomes are, going back to the if and then statements, right? So if we provide X in terms of the activities, the result will be Y. while a theory of change includes the causal mechanisms to show why each intervention or component is expected to result in the intended outcomes. It's the why which is more critical in a theory of change. So if we provide X, A will support or even potentially hinder the result of Y. Right? So the logic models ideally include a section for contextual factors and assumptions. These are not detailed enough within each part of the logic model, and sometimes they are just left out altogether. So some of the more linear logic models, you will just see, well, there are resources, activities, outputs, outcomes, done. A theory of change actually includes these factors, going back to the needs and assumptions where appropriate throughout the model. As such, a logic model is very descriptive, while a theory of change is explanatory, the why aspect. So this actually comes out of the utilization focus evaluation from Michael Patton. So please take a look as to and decide which one is more appropriate for your needs. So what does it look like when we combine a theory of change and a logic model, right? So for those who attended at my session last week, this content may sound a little bit familiar, of kind of a word salad where I kind of use some terms, epistemology and ontology, so I would not go too much into details. I don't want to be philosophizing at you. But these underlying factors and sociology and methodology terms come in handy when you're actually developing a theory of change or a logic model. Next slide, please. All right, so here's an image. I was just simply fascinated by this image, so I'm sharing it here. So while reading one literature, I think it was last year, I really liked the theory of change and how they explain how various components actually feed into the outcome process. So this particular article is called Theory of Systems Change, an initial mid-range theory of public health research, impact by Melinda Craig and her team. It's very theoretical and academic, so bear with me as I try to summarize it here. So in a sense, this paper dwells into the connection between proving research impact and applying a systems thinking approach in the field of public health. It essentially tackles the challenge of understanding how public health research, using a systems thinking perspective, really affects system behavior and betters the population health outcomes. It also introduces a theory of change, systems change, by combining insights from the research impact, theory-based evaluation, and systems thinking literature. So the way I look at it, this theory really impacts or highlights the importance of well-functioning systems in promoting better health outcomes, while also emphasizing properties like local context, mechanisms, adaptation, alignment, and close collaboration and partnerships, while also looking at data-driven action. All of them are really applicable to our S-STEM program. The theory of systems change also provides a useful guide for researchers to develop project-specific theories and serves as a foundation for accumulating knowledge generation. So your theory of change doesn't need to be this complicated, but I just wanted to share that it could be as complicated or it could be as simple and straightforward as the previous slide. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about assumptions and hypotheses. So we know that the S-STEM projects, they have this whole section on knowledge generation or generation of knowledge, GOK. So your S-STEM program's assumptions or needs or context must be carefully examined before you even form and test the hypothesis. If we do this, we expect to see this change. It's like knowing your audience first before coming up with a grand communication or a marketing plan, right? So again, so your S-STEM program's assumptions context must be carefully examined before forming and testing any of the hypotheses, especially while developing your evaluation and your logic model. I mentioned this before. Assumptions are those underlying beliefs about how and why something is expected to work. So if these assumptions are flawed or unverified, then any hypothesis that is built upon them will most likely be misleading, leading to ineffective or misdirected evaluation efforts. So just like a shaky foundation can cause a building to collapse, weak assumptions can undermine the entire evaluation process. That's why evaluators must first scrutinize and validate their assumptions. What are those beliefs? Through literature review, stakeholder input, or even preliminary data analysis to ensure that their hypotheses are built on solid ground. And once these assumptions are carefully considered, hypothesis testing systematically determines whether the anticipated relationships between the resources or activities, outputs, and outcomes really hold true. Without this critical step, we risk assuming causality where none exists or missing unintended consequences. Therefore, a well-structured evaluation doesn't just accept assumptions at face value, it really challenges them, understands them, and gathers evidence. Again, going back to my mantra, context really, really matters. All right, so next slide, please. Here are some really good templates. I've actually plugged them for you from evaluate.org website. If you go to the website, there's actually a Word document. You could just download it and use it as you please for your program. And the other one is, again, University of Wisconsin Extension Department. I believe I have the direct links in the resources reference slide. So please be sure to use them and again, put them in your supplementary document. But also make sure, again, if I were writing the proposal, I would just annotate saying that the evaluation plan really is aligned with the logic model, which can be found in the supplementary document. So make sure that you annotate them. Next slide, please. All right, there's another template with some hints, right? So if you're stuck and you want to make sure that you have the inputs, the activities, outputs, and the outcomes in the right place, and you're using the right terms and the right activities at the right location, here is an example. Inputs or resources, always the first one, as I would do it, NSF funding, right? You are definitely going to write that as the first item under inputs or resources. Activities are all those activities that you're going to do, the interventions, learning community or, living learning community, advising, mentoring, all of them will come under your activities. Summer-based program, first-year experience, first-year seminar, all of them are activities. Outputs, again, bean counting, how many, how often, right? These are the observable and tangible items that are expected to be achieved. Short-term outcomes, immediate changes that you expect to see. Midterm, while the grant is still in place, what kind of midterm outcomes are you expecting to see? And the long-term are what results should really follow from the initial outcomes, and ultimately, what is the impact, the efficacy of your program? That constitutes the long-term outcomes of your S-STEM program. So use this as you wish. Make sure that it is really catering to your program. Just don't copy and paste. Please don't. Use it as it relates and aligns with your S-STEM program. Next slide, please. There you go. So here is, it's not a test. Here is an exercise, and I think you will really enjoy it. So let's launch the link and see if we can all participate. And there are some hints in there in terms of what constitutes the inputs or resources, activities, processes, outputs, outcomes. So please participate. We have about 15 minutes. So we can learn from each other in terms of what are some of the potential needs and gaps that your program wants to fill, and how is S-STEM going to work for you. Tara, do we have the link ready? Awesome. Great. It's 1:45 p.m. Eastern. Another maybe 10-15 minutes. Is that okay, Tara? Great, thank you. Is there a way for us to launch and show it on the screen, the link?
Would it make sense for us to take down the slides and to
I see.
instead show the document?
Okay. Oh, nice. Good. Nina or Stephen, you think you could probably summarize for a minute at 2 o'clock, perhaps? Stephen, you'd like to summarize at the end?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Thanks. Maybe 2 more minutes. We have inputs, outputs. Yeah, pretty much we are quite close, right, Stephen?
Yeah, the list is looking pretty good. I'm just getting a couple notes prepared.
Sure.
Right, I think I'm ready to summarize whenever everyone's good to go.
Sounds good.
All right, so just looking through the various components, starting at the top, needs, problems, issues, challenges. A lot of common threads looking at trying to increase the number of students in STEM or those that are majoring in STEM fields, as well as promoting retention of STEM students, all the way through to STEM employment and graduation. So just retaining them throughout their undergraduate experience. Increase student support services, including financials, as well as potential lodging needs for students. Increasing the percentage of Pell eligible students. So a lot of common threads that certainly feels like we've seen in a lot of contexts before. Looking at some assumptions. Assumption, a nice one that I saw, seeing that STEM fields are often of more rigorous demand, curricularly, as well as just the time that it takes for students to do that, for STEM students compared to non-STEM students, especially considering, additional lab courses and stuff like that. I can see that as a very important need for those students. So background assumption there. Exploration and exposure to industry careers was another one that was good. And a big lack of implicit academic norms, especially among, as a barrier for first generation students, as well as having to navigate the complicated transfer process, especially for students that are kind of unaware of how to best go about that process, and moving potentially from a 2-year to 4-year institution. Inputs, looking at obviously the S-STEM team itself, Co-PI, PI, and any other associated faculty and staff. Existing student support services that already exist on campus, certainly good ideas for things to be leveraged. Financial support, as well as partnerships, whether internal or external to the college. Activities, including internships and workshops. Experiential learning is a good one as well, especially for within STEM fields. That's certainly a big component. It's, a lot of hands-on learning, and having students become more aware of their strengths, something that could maybe be further developed through student support services as well. Outputs, so these are a lot things that certainly align with the needs to try to solve those problems or speak to those problems. So they have a lot of measurables that relate to those needs, including graduation rates, the number of students that have been able to be served by student support services, those retained, those that are majoring in STEM fields, as well as those partaking in a lot of the activities, including the internships, workshops, different learning experiences. And then these broader outcomes, including career readiness. One I thought was interesting is speaking to a little bit of autonomy and career decision making and being more comfortable with making those types of decisions for themselves based on their experience. So that can be seen as some of these intangibles that can be taken away as outcomes for students. Social mobility, graduation, and ultimately just degree attainment and transfer. So setting students up for success in graduation and beyond in their careers. So so those were some of the highlights we saw from across the components of the logic model.
Excellent. Thank you. I hope this exercise was useful. You have access to the link, so you could pull any of the information that is pertinent to your program over to your proposal. All right, next slide, please. All right, so here someone has actually completed the assignment for you. So this is an actual S-STEM logic model, which talks about the ongoing needs, some of the assumptions of the S-STEM program, the inputs, activities, outputs, and the outcomes differentiated through the short term, midterm, and long term. So this is our real example of a logic model. All right, next slide, please. So let's also talk about some of the limitations or quirks of logic models. So as I mentioned before, logic models usually follow a straight line. They're very linear, classic. If this, then that scenario, right? If this, then that scenario. But in the real world, we know that things are a bit messy and the relationships are not always clear-cut or linear. So the logic models also tend to oversimplify the stuff. So if we do this, then this will happen, and then we can see this. So this might kind of exaggerate how one thing causes another and downplay the role of other factors that matter. Again, going back to context and assumptions. So a nifty way to handle this is by acknowledging the real world stuff, the community needs, the assumptions, the context. All those things could also be embedded in the logic model. Then there is also the issue of turning into relics. Logic models often get drafted during the project planning and the proposal, of course, and then they collect virtual dust. We want to make sure that the logic model is often visited. We want to be able to go back to the logic model to tell us, well, what did we propose? What are some of the activities that we planned and intended to do? Where are we with the outputs? How are the participation numbers looking? What are some of the outcomes? What are some of the immediate outcomes, the short term and the long term? So this really should be a living, breathing document or a blueprint or a map, which is often referred to and not just kind of left alone in the proposal. So we should make it a habit to dust it off and give the logic model a makeover regularly to keep up how the project, how your S-STEM program and project is really evolving over the grant period. So sometimes also the logic models, they play hide and seek with unintended outcomes or consequences. So they focus so much on the intended results that they often miss the unexpected twists a project might bring. So evaluators using these models should really keep an eye out for those surprises too. So that's logic models. Linear assumptions, oversimplifying pals, prone to gathering dust, and sometimes they also overlook the surprises. So we should all keep the logic model in check, right? That's why I've been harping on combining both the logic model and a theory of change, because that builds in the complexities, that builds in the context and the assumptions of the program that you're running, your S-STEM program. All right, next slide, please. So here's a very simple checklist while you're developing a logic model, is make sure that you want your logic model to be obviously logical, and it is making meaningful connections between the various components, the components being inputs, resources, activities, outputs, and outcomes. That it is clear, it is not cluttered, meaning you don't want to have references built in, it just takes up too much space and you just don't have the space. It should be clean, it should be clear and not cluttered. So you decide if what is too much, too little, just right. A simple table or a matrix will be just fine, but you want to make sure that you have all the items within each of the component of a logic model. You also want to make sure that the intended outcomes are aligned very well with your project's goals and objectives, and that your evaluation is aligned with the logic model. You want to make sure that the outcomes are realistic. Are these something that can be attained, right? Does the logic model take into consideration the needs and gaps, going back to the context and assumptions? And what are some of the underlying assumptions which are also accounted for in your logic model? Is the logic model developed in collaboration with the key program team members, including the evaluator or a social science researcher? In many cases, it is a collaborative effort. The meaning of this is that the PI or the co-PI are on the ground at the institution. They know the needs, the assumptions, and the context within which an S-STEM program is functioning. While the evaluator, if they are external, completely external consultant, they may not know the context. So it helps to work collaboratively with the PI or co-PI or senior personnel while developing a logic model. You also want to make sure that the logic model contains information to show how the project intends to bring about change over time. Goes back to the outcomes. You could have just one column for overall outcomes, or you could break it down into short-term, mid-term, and long-term outcomes. Next slide, please. This is the best part. So Tara had mentioned that we have a guidebook. So this guidebook has only 4 chapters. It is under 50 pages. Actually, it is only 47 pages. So you should be able to read it in an hour or hour and a half. So we encourage you to check this out. It has 4 chapters. Chapter 1 is needs assessment. Chapter 2 is evidence-based practices. We talked about both needs assessment and evidence-based practices in our last week's proposal development webinar. And we talk about the same thing in the guidebook in much more details. Chapter 3 is designing knowledge generation and evaluation plans. And chapter 4 is about logic model or theory of change. So we definitely go into much more details, provide some examples, differentiate between logic model, theory of change, and also talk about the similarities. So please check it out when you have a moment and use it as you wish. Next slide, please. Oh, here are the sections which actually talk about the logic model. So we talk about what a logic model is all about. We differentiate between a logic model, a theory of change. How are they useful? What are the key features of both? Next slide, please. And then actually we talk about the logic model. Here's an example of a logic model. Next slide, please. So we sometimes get questions about when to engage an evaluator. Again, there are some considerations based on our experience evaluating several grants, S-STEM grants and other grants, is that look at the evaluator as a partner and a collaborator, meaning that you would want to engage with an evaluator, with an evaluator early and often in your pre-proposal phase, right? Also, you develop your logic model and theory of change with the evaluator. And I mentioned as to why it's important to also have a PI, co-PI contribute and then co-develop the logic model or theory of change as a collaborative process. The evaluator could be totally external or someone from another department within the institution, and that is allowed, and that is mentioned in the solicitation. You would also want to look at the general qualifications of an evaluator in terms of their experience with NSF grants, with S-STEM grants, and in general, their time, their effort, and their experience. You may also want to engage in evaluating the proposal planning, as I mentioned. They would write the evaluation plan and collaborate in completing the logic model or theory of change. You should also be able to set some general expectations from a third-party evaluator before and after award. And most important, really, is that you want to make sure that you are fully aware of of your institution's procurement procedures, which means that in some of the community colleges that we have worked with, we were told that even if we are written into a grant, well, first of all, in most cases, we are not named. We are not allowed to be named in the grant, even if we have worked on the evaluation plan, because there is a procurement or competitive bidding process. So you want to make sure that you have spoken to your office of sponsored programs or finance department to make sure what kind of policies and practices are in place so that the evaluator is well aware before jumping in and committing to working with you prior being awarded. Again, budget, again, it really depends on the scope of work, the number of hours that might take to develop the evaluation plan after the award. Meetings, typically an evaluator for an S-STEM grant will spend time with project meetings, also going through the IRB process if there is one that is required, and also collecting data. Typically, we do fall surveys and spring surveys, and some of those locations that are close to where we are located, we also do a site visit. So all these things really need to be chalked out before you engage with an evaluator and add them as a consultant, as a line item in your budget. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. This is almost the end. We have some references, lots of references, live links. So please feel free to click on them and you can download many of the templates that I actually had mentioned here. And there are some of the other new templates too. I think new resources someone had shared. So thank you for that. So yeah, good luck. Next slide. There you go. Good luck. Thank you.
So this is Nina Dallas with M&S Associates. And so I encourage you all to take this moment to post your questions, ideally on the Q&A. We've already answered a few of them already, and you can see there under the tab Answered. And we have one outstanding, which I'll go ahead and ask and allow Kavita to answer.
So at what point in the proposal writing process do people typically create a theory of change or logic model? I imagine that this one would recommend creating it before writing anything. However, I see the instance where you don't completely complete it until after you've finished your proposal. In other words, they're typically more used as a tool for mapping out the project in advance of writing, or is it a living document that develops over the course of planning? The latter. So you basically have answered your own question, Adam. It's basically you are mapping out the project while you're writing the proposal, because the logic model really is giving you a roadmap of how the project is going to be advancing, right? So while you're writing a proposal, you have the goals, you have goals, you have your objectives, and you have your activities, interventions, and such, right? So while you're doing that, that's when you're also developing the logic model, because a logic model must speak to the goals and objectives. And at the same time, the evaluation is aligned, very closely aligned with the evaluation plan. So all of them are kind of moving parts, but they're also moving together. So it's really critical that you do them all around the same time. And the usage of logic model is when you're actually using that as your roadmap, as a blueprint. If any activities are changing, shifting, for instance, if you plan to do a summer program the year of the grant when it was awarded, but you were not able to do so, you still have that in your mind that, okay, we didn't do it in 2026, but we are going to do it in 2027. It happens. because maybe you don't have a fully formed cohort. Maybe you don't have certain things that you said you were going to have. So some of the activities will shift, but you have that map in front of you saying that, okay, these activities must be completed. We have another question. Having research questions is necessary or required for track 2? Yes, your research questions are required for track 2. And what are the pros and cons of research questions in each case? So we covered this pretty extensively, Behram, last week in our generation of knowledge and evaluation plan webinar. So if you get a moment, do check out some of the slides which are online. And I think we're also planning to put up the recording in terms of who does the work and what is the function of the research questions essentially, right? So you are required to build the generation of knowledge in all the tracks. Who does that is a different question. For track 1 and track 2 and track 3, the evaluation team is supposed to generate the knowledge and also contribute and do the evaluation, a robust evaluation. In track 3, the social science researcher, who could be a PI or a co-PI, they contribute to the social science research. So it's really critical that you read this whole section. There's like a big section on research and evaluation, knowledge generation part in the solicitation. So please do read that in terms of who does that, and then what is the importance of the research questions. Anybody else? Any other questions? Any other questions, comments, concerns? Or you get your 15 minutes back and you can complete your assignment. I did notice that the moment I said assignment, 10 people dropped off. So yeah. Cool. If we don't have anything, right, Tara, we can go to the next slide and then finish it off. Thank you.
So thank you all for joining us today. And a big thank you to Kavita, Nina, and the M&A team for sharing their knowledge with us. If you'd like to request a quick consultation with Kavita, or if you have additional questions, please fill out the evaluation TA request form, and the M&A team will be sure to follow up with you. Here's that link. Also, speaking of evaluation, we'd love to receive your feedback on today's webinar by taking our short survey. In addition to being on this slide, and I'll put it in the chat, the link will appear when you exit Zoom today. We really appreciate your feedback. It's important to us as we use it to improve our activities and our offerings. So thanks in advance for sharing your thoughts. And our final slide. It's great to connect with you today. And for those who are engaging with the S-STEM REC for the first time, we welcome you and are happy to meet you. We hope you keep in touch with us, and we hope to see you at future webinars, events, and activities. You can sign up to receive our monthly newsletter and help us build community by interacting with us on social media. And we have all of our links to our social media sites, which I've also just put in the chat. So thank you everybody again today for joining us, and we really appreciate your participation and look forward to engaging with you at future events. Best of luck with your S-STEM proposals. Thanks.